Thank you so much again. John Cooley.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks a lot for that introduction. I also want to point out Greg Holmes in the back, who's photographer. Long story. He's been a stalwart in the cicada trip, and this is a strange business that we engage in, cicada work. And I think maybe by the end of this you'll appreciate that a little bit more. What I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to talk a little bit about cicadas in general and less about the periodical cicadas. And then this afternoon I'll come back and give you some specifics about the periodical cicadas, why we're so interested in them, and why we're interested in the brood that we have here, brood 4. So I'm going to start out just talking in general about cicadas and what we know about them. This is part of a larger project. We have a project with lots of collaborators, lots of different topics that we're looking at, lots of cicada species we're looking at. And so what I'll be talking about is little pieces and background information to this larger project that involves everything from the mapping that I'm out doing to genetics, bench work, historical research, you name it, we're definitely trying it. Cicadas are so fascinating, so interesting that you just can't stay away, and you have to find different ways to go after the problems that they present. Now, you might ask, how did I get into cicadas? Well, I grew up in Kansas City, and we have a lot of cicadas in Kansas City. And this is a picture of a cicada that I drew when I was about 4 or 5. I've been fascinated by these things right from the beginning. And this is an interesting picture in many different ways. I got the eyes right, the eyes, and I've also labeled it locus. Now, locus genetics. Locus is an address on a chromosome, and I've later done some genetic work. Locust is also a name that's been stuck on cicadas in error. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through this. So I got interested in this early on. Turns out that when you go back and you look at cicadas through history, they actually leave a nice historical trail. And so they come into Western literature, as it were, in ancient Greece. Poets who talk about cicadas, but they get them mixed up with locusts. They talk about the grasshopper, the locust that spends its summer afternoons singing away in the treetops. Now, how many of you have seen grasshoppers in the treetops? It doesn't happen. It's an early confusion of grasshoppers and cicadas, and what the Greek poets were talking about were cicadas singing in the treetops. Greek poets did a lot of other things, not all of which are necessarily the kinds of things we do today. They wrote sort of scurrilous poems. And one of the poems that I like to point out, because this is one of those things that comes back and gets you in the end, and I will point it out, is a horrifically sexist and annoying poem from the poet Xenarchus, who said, in rough translation, "Happy are cicadas, for their wives are silent." Now, that sets the stage 2,000 years ago for a misunderstanding that has continued to this day. And we'll come back to how that's actually dead wrong. And it's taken a long time to find that mistake. So I point that poem out. All the things that we see in cicada literature get set up right here in ancient Greece. Locusts, grasshoppers, misunderstanding of the signals, there it is. Same problems for 2,000 years. I hope we have some answers now. In China, when you died, often a cicada would be placed on your tongue before you were buried, so that you would have voice in the afterlife. And so cicadas figure into the literature and mythology worldwide. I'm just going to show some examples of that. In China, cicadas are also part of folk medicine. And so this is a Chinese folk medicine. It's actually a fungus, the medicine, that grows on cicada nymphs underground and creates this strange fungal fruiting body. And that is ground up and turned into medicine that does who knows what. But it is part of folk medicine in many Asian cultures. This is a Maori carving, kihi, or the Maori word for cicada. And if you go to New Zealand, if you have that pleasure, you'll find that there are 40 or so species of cicadas. It's a very small place. New Zealand is actually the size of the state of Colorado. And yet they have 40 species of cicadas there. And this is a carving that depicts a cicada. And the Maori word is kihi, The generic name for about a third to a half of the New Zealand species is now kikihia. And so there are lots of cicadas in New Zealand, including alpine cicadas, very strange things. Things that live up in the mountaintops and will be out there when there's snow. And that's not known anywhere else in the world. These are some French plates from Provence. And cicadas figure into French art and culture as well. So you can go there and buy these. They're always the same. They're these yellow plates with the kind of greenish cicada. And this is a modern artwork made here in North America. It's a tile piece with a poem on it. Shannon Amida made this, and you can buy all kinds of artworks that have cicadas in them. And different cultures have different ways of appreciating cicadas. This is shot in Australia, where they're actually in the midst of a terrible drought, but it's normally dry anyway. And this is in a cafe where you can pull off and stop, and a little sign says they're really into chalkboard signs there that have cute little sayings on it. Churches here do that kind of stuff, but there it's the cafes. He gave us rain, approximately 35 minutes, and cicadas, because Australia is crawling with cicadas. Now, Australia has roughly the land area of the United States, comparable in size. They probably have 1,000 different species of cicadas in Australia. Here in the United States, we probably only have 250. So Australia is the epicenter of cicadas. And some of them are quite loud. If you think cicadas here in North America are loud, you need to go to Australia. Some of those are like car horns, and they are intolerable. You cannot be near them. It's painful. Luckily, the ones that are really bad like that only chorus in the evenings. So it's over after about 35 minutes, and you can have some peace. Cicadas, you have cicada stamps. There's a French cicada stamp, and here in the U.S., we had a cicada stamp for a while, back when postage was 33 cents. Whatever it is now, because we have these forever stamps, who knows. But we did have a periodical cicada stamp here in the U.S. for a while that you could stick on your postage. And there are cicada toys. Lots of them, and you can look on the internet. Greg, you probably saw Dave had one of these, the Twitter bug. Yeah, Beanie Baby, this is the cicada clicker, the cicada puzzle, and the toy of all toys, the infamous cicada keychain. When these things show up on eBay, you would be stunned at what they go for. And there are people out there who've tried to track down the manufacturer. This is the kind of thing where somebody imported a box load of them from China, and they all sold out 15 years ago, and now it's the coveted item. I did actually have one once. I don't know what happened to it. But I can tell you, it was fundamentally the most irritating toy ever. If you're a parent out there, you know all about toys with batteries, and how you really regret toys with batteries. And this was the most regrettable of them all because it was loud and it was obnoxious. And now it is coveted. It's the infamous Lucky Cicada keychain. And if you find one of those, get up on eBay immediately. You'll make your fortune. Oh, there are poetry magazines, albums, all that about cicadas. So cicadas figure into culture. And there are children's books about cicadas. And I have to say, of all the children's books of cicadas that I've seen, this one right here by Joan Ryder, When the Woods Hum, that is a fantastic kids book. And if you're looking to teach children about periodical cicadas, that's the book. It gets the biology exactly right. And think about this. Where were you 17 years ago? Yeah, some of you weren't even here. So where will you be? Yeah, exactly. Where will you be in 17 years?
We don't want to know.
No, yeah, you don't want to know. So this book really encapsulates that. It's a wonderful book. Artwork. Natsuke, this is a little snuff box. It opens up and snuff inside. Carvings. This one right here is a stunner. I found this on eBay. It's a Cicada Lamp. Oh, wow. It's a clear glass thing that's been filled up with the shed skins. Yeah. You know, you can sort of see that. A leek cicada, various carvings, and so forth and so on. Well, cicadas figure into culture the world over. They don't often figure into our American culture. We tend to shy away from them. The rest of the world's in love with cicadas. We're not. Some of us are in love with them. This is David Rothenberg, a musician in the greater New York metro area, and he's actually playing music with cicadas. So some of us are tuned into cicadas, but most of us are not. And that's actually the back of my car, which I miss very much because the rental car that I'm driving it thinks too much for me. I'm an analog person, this car is not analog. So cicadas, there are lots of them. There are probably 5,000 species of them around the world. And we have all different kinds. This is a kikihia from New Zealand. These are all pictures the cicada team has shot over the years. This is a kikihia, that's a rhodopsalta. This is Frogatoides from Australia. This is a Maori cicada, one of those mountain cicadas in New Zealand. We have a tabison here, Okanagan, Magicicada, another tabison right there. So lots of different species of cicadas, probably 5,000 around the world. We just don't know. You go around, it's one of those great undiscovered things. You find new species if you look carefully enough. Things that have never been described or known before. Now, what do all cicadas do? It's time to talk a little bit about their biology. All cicadas begin life, like all of us do, male and female mate, female lays eggs. So this is a female right here laying eggs in a branch. And these are what the eggs look like. So these are healthy eggs, and you can see a little eye spot there, they're getting ready to hatch. These are unhealthy eggs. Something happened to these eggs along the way. One of the things that can happen is that when the females lay their eggs densely in tree branches, and I'll show a picture of this in just a minute, the branches can die or wilt, and that will kill the eggs. The eggs must be laid, for periodical cicadas, in live branches. Now other cicadas lay in other things, but periodical cicadas lay in live branches. And these are hatched eggs, and you can see it's popped open, and the hatchling has crawled out. They live underground as 5 instars. Now, cicadas are insects, and they're a little bit different. It sounds a little bit like science fiction. We're animals with our skeletons on the inside. We can just grow, and it's not a big deal. You start out small, you get big. When your skeleton's on the outside, as with insects or crustaceans, lobsters, crabs, things like that, when those animals grow, they grow in quantum leaps because they have to shed their skeleton to grow, because you can't have a hard thing on the outside and then get bigger. So they have to peel that off and grow. So those are called instars, and cicadas go through 5 instars. They start off really small, like an ant, and they go through these instars, and they get quite big. And right the fall before they're going to emerge, they get red eyes. So this one is not ready to emerge. They get red eyes, and then they're ready to come out. So they're living underground. They make these little chambers, these little tunnels. And then they come out. And there's a red-eyed nymph. It's up on it's on a tree trunk, actually. And it's walking around looking for a place to molt. One last time. And there it is, it's molting. Now, insects are funny things. Most insects, when you see an insect that has wings, that's it. That's the adult. Insects almost never molt over wings because molting is a very dangerous and risky process. Many insects die during this. It's a dangerous, vulnerable time for them. So when you see the adult with the wings, there you go. And what this insect has to do is it has to pop out and actually inflate the wings. They're all folded up, crunched up, and it has to inflate them. And I don't have that picture in this slideshow. I'll show you a picture of that this afternoon. So they molt, and then they become adults. And this is the adult cicada. And you can see it's a nice clear wings. Most cicadas have clear wings. It's got 6 legs. It's an insect, a very visible feeding tube. Adult cicadas do feed. It's one of those myths that they don't. And big beady eyes. And this is Okanagan canadensis. It's a male. It's in northern Michigan, and it's in a very typical calling posture. So what cicadas do when they're adults is they call. Now, one of the things you may not realize is only the males call. So males have a pair of sound-producing organs right there on the first abdominal segment, one on each side. They're called tymbals. And it looks like a little ridged potato chip. It's a membranous structure. The white parts are thin membrane. The dark parts are hardened material, exoskeleton material. And what the cicadas can do is this membrane is mounted on a frame. They use a pair of strong muscles to put tension on that frame, and that tension is released when those membranes vibrate. When those membranes vibrate, they make a sound. The abdomen is hollow, and so that sound is amplified and radiates out. But when you hear cicadas calling, you're only hearing half the population, because only males have these organs. And that's the source of what the Greek poets said about the males. But it turns out that's not the only way to make a sound. So cicadas make these loud sounds. Male cicadas make these loud sounds. Before I dive into that, I have to tell you a little bit about how we, as scientists, think about sounds. How many of you remember 16mm movies? Yeah, from grade school, right? And there was a soundtrack on the side when you looked at those film strips. And it looked like this. That's an oscillogram. And that's a graph of sound intensity or volume over time. That's one way that we look at sounds. We also look at sonograms or pitch over time. And so this is song pitch. This is 1,000 hertz, 1 kilohertz. And this is 2,000 or 2 kilohertz. I'm speaking at about 600 or 700 hertz. Anybody know what that is? So here's time, there's pitch. Anybody want to work it out?
Like musical notation?
It is music.
Song?
It is a song.
Those that like the notes.
And those are like the notes. That's how these work. And I can tell you a story about that. The reason I chose Yankee Doodle, it's a story. I can tell you after this talk is over why. This is a spectrum. Most of the energy, and these are all of the same thing, most of the energy here is between 1 and 2 kilohertz. 10 kilohertz is very high. I can't even make sounds like that. Most of the energy in this sound, 1 and 2 kilohertz, that's about where we speak. It's where our music is. It's where we hear. So that's how we talk about sound. For cicadas, these sonograms tend to be the most useful. So this is a periodical cicada, Magicicada septendecim, and this is a sonogram of the song. That's the sound that septendecim makes. And you can see this is one individual close to the microphone in a chorus of lots of individuals. That's all this noise back here is all the other cicadas. And so that's a typical periodical cicada sound. It's not a typical cicada sound because it's very musical. Most cicadas are rhythmic. But that's a periodical cicada sound. And here's why the Greek poets were wrong. There's another sound here. It's a click. You can see it's broad spectrum. It's going up to 10 and 11 kilohertz. And to make a long story short, that's the female. She's not silent. Now, she doesn't have sound-producing organs. She's not making a musical sound like this. But she's making a sound, and it's a click, just like that. That's the sound. And they are duetting. So the Greek poets are wrong. Males and females are talking to each other. The males are making loud, obnoxious sounds. Females are making quiet sounds, and they're driving this interaction. Greek poets had it backwards. Turns out most cicadas do things like that. So here's Okanagan and canadensis. I have a sonogram right here and a oscillogram right here. This is a pulsing song, kind of a sound like that. And you can see here the female is sticking wing flicks in these silent spaces. Click, 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 click. They're duetting. This is Kikihia tuta. It's a New Zealand swamp species. Now, if you're in the insect world, you know that there aren't many insects that can tolerate salt water. I don't know why. Colembala hang out in salt water, crabs, all those crustaceans hang out in salt water. Not insects, except these things live in salt marshes. So the soil they're in is salty. And actually they live in places that are inundated at high tide. So here's an insect that lives in salty soil. it makes a funny little sound. Quiet little sound like that. And look what the female's doing. She's sticking a click right in between those pulses. They're duetting. So, cicadas duet. That's the key to their mating system. That's the key to their mating signals. You learn how to imitate that, you can make the cicadas do anything. We don't even bother to take nets with us to New Zealand anymore. You can click to all those cicadas and have them come to you. You can do the same thing with periodical cicadas. I want to spend just a minute talking about periodical cicadas and their history. I'll do a little bit more specifics about their biology this afternoon. But I want to talk about how they show up in our culture, in our history, because they're a little bit special. It's special because they come out in big numbers, millions per acre. Now, other cicadas have boom and bust years or times, but nothing like this. When you see a full periodical cicada emergence, it is a stunner. And if you have the Cicada species, this is the kind of thing that I get a lot of people who write into me in the website, and they write in, when will it be over? And these are the people who have the Cicada species, because this is something that you hear on the highway when you're driving down the road at 80 miles an hour with the windows shut and the air conditioner on. It is that loud. It's 110 or more decibels, especially when these guys synchronize, which they do. So they're something special. And they show up in our culture, and I think this is why all cicadas are looked at askance by Americans, but they show up in our culture right back with the Pilgrims in Massachusetts, because it turns out the Massachusetts Bay Colony had periodical cicadas. And they get off the boat, they're starting a colony up there. Any group of people, you know, somebody's always doing something wrong, right? Somebody's always misbehaving, secrets are kept. Well, if you're in a religiously oriented colony that's really tuned in to things like 10 plagues, all right, you know somebody's been up to something, somebody's been up to no good, and then all of a sudden, boom, all these bugs are out, it's the 10 plagues. You know, next thing is frogs or something like that. Right away in the 1600s, they get stuck with the name locusts here in North America. Again, there's that theme, confusing them with grasshoppers. Now, they're not really plagues. They're not locusts. They don't even, bother crops. But nonetheless, the early American religious colonists were afraid of these things. And so it starts this attitude we have towards cicadas. Other colonists pointed out, well, these things are actually manna from heaven. This is the manna that John the Baptist, or the locust that John the Baptist was so famous for. Now, it didn't exactly work out so well for John the Baptist, as we all know, but nonetheless, there's a little bit of a positive spin in some circles as well. Other colonists talked about how they stinged, in the old sort of way of spelling S-T-I-N-G-E-D, stinged the trees to death. And what they're referring to here is the oviposition. The females lay the eggs, and if they lay a lot of eggs in a tree, and you get a thunderstorm or something that whips that tree around, those branch ends will flop over and die and turn brown. And it looks as though the tree has been harmed in some fundamental way. It turns out that's not usually the case. It doesn't seem to have any effect at all on the trees, unless you're talking about people who are running an orchard or something like that, because if you get the ends of the branch weakened, it's going to affect your fruit set. All those giant apples and so forth start to set later in the summer, snap, it breaks off, no crop that year. Now, Thomas Jefferson checks in with a statement about them. He has a garden book, and he was one of the early people in literature who said the life cycle really is about 17 years, exactly. And he noted that. But he got a few other things wrong, and he got the whole business about the males and females signaling. He didn't get that at all. Again, he repeated the claim that only the males make sounds and the females just sit around and do nothing. Take what you will with that. Thomas Jefferson may not have been the most perceptive person in the world for understanding how these male and female cicadas interact with each other. About that time, another myth got started here in North America, and that is that when the cicadas come out, there's going to be a war. Why? Because there's a W on the wings. Now let's think that out. This is the ultimate self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are talking about the 1700s here in America, there's always a war on with somebody. French, the British, various native tribes. There's always a war on, and the cicadas are coming out almost every year, somewhere. And so it's fairly easy to get this self-perpetuating myth going. When they come out, there's going to be a war. Well, every time they came out, there was a war. Why? There was always a war. The flip side of that is to look at the oral traditions of some of the Native Americans. Many of those wars in the 1700s were with native groups. And one of those groups is the Onondaga of upstate New York. They're near Syracuse. And I had the pleasure to meet Peter Edwards in 2001, who's an Onondaga member. And he told me their oral traditions. And it turns out that in the Onondaga universe, cicadas occupy an exalted position because the periodical cicadas saved them. Why? They were having a dust up with the British. The British decided they were going to end this once and for all. They went through there and they burned all the crops, destroyed everything, expecting the Onondaga then to just pack it in and leave, starve to death, or something. But it turns out it was a periodical cicada year. So that didn't happen. So the cicadas sustained the Onondaga in their time of need, and since then the Onondaga have kept very careful records and watch over the cicadas. Their brood is brood 7, the Onondaga brood of upstate New York. Charles Darwin actually checks in and makes a few comments about the cicadas, and he discusses the problem of the fact that there actually are 2 life cycles of periodical cicadas. There are the 17-year cicadas that Thomas Jefferson noted, but there are also 13-year cicadas that tend to live further south. And he began, or continuing, whatever you want to say, he got involved in a discussion about the differences between 13 and 17-year cicadas, a discussion that's ongoing to this day. Formal scientific study of periodical cicadas really got going in the 19th century. Charles Riley was a U.S. government entomologist who published a number of excellent papers about periodical cicadas, including this right here, Supplement to the Insects of Missouri, with this wonderful plate right here that you'll often find. Now it's out of copyright, so it's on t-shirts and everything else. So you can buy one of these on the internet. Greg wants 10. Charles Marlatt was his successor at the Bureau of Agriculture. This is actually before the USDA. So it was Bureau of Agriculture back then. Charles Marlatt was his successor. And Marlatt developed the naming scheme that we use today for the various periodical cicada broods, using Roman numerals and starting with an arbitrary starting point. And so you see we have 17-year broods 1 through 14 and 13-year broods 19 through 23. Or to put those in, no, I don't have that slide here either. This is the brood that we're having this year, brood 4. But this is actually a co-emergence here. We're also having the brood of 13-year cicadas right here, brood 23. J.G. Myers published a wonderful book that you can find this on the internet, but you'll pay dearly for it. This is a book called Insect Singers, published in 1923. It's a wonderful book. It just tells the basic natural history of cicadas, and it's an invaluable resource. This is a bladder cicada from Australia. It's a great big hollow thing that makes a funny echoey pure tone call, a very low pitch. Strange, they only sing at dusk. Very, very odd beast. Can barely fly, it's just a great big floppy human being. This is Charles Remington at Yale, who was a great cicada enthusiast. And he was always famous when there were emergences in the East Coast for talking about recipes in periodical cicadas. So he got a number of write-ups in the New York Times for recipes, and this is one right here. There's a catch, and by the way, that continues to this day. Here's one from 2007. I'm sure you'll find paper articles even now about recipes. There is a catch, and that's the catch. They're mercury bioaccumulators. How many of you have heard about that when you go fishing? Well, you hear about that when you go fishing for cicadas as well. These are living underground for 17 years. There are a lot of coal-fired power plants in the Midwest. One of the byproducts of a coal-fired power plant is mercury that's injected into the atmosphere. It lands somewhere, and it lands somewhere, and it's picked up by the cicadas over the course of 17 years. And so maybe it's not a great idea to eat a lot of these. Again, this theme, though, that cicadas are a problem shows up. This is from the Chicago Botanic Garden. Pests, problems, and diseases. Such negativity. This is the cicada wedding planner, at least one version of it. If you're having an outdoor wedding, in a cicada place, maybe you're not going to need to hire any music because nature's going to supply it. And so this is a website that was set up to help you plan your wedding, either to include the cicadas if you're inclined that way, or to exclude the cicadas if you're not. And of course, there you go. A famous picture from 2004.
Get him.
There's actually a scientific paper about cicada-related injuries.
What?
Yes, and if you read this, it really is, it's a bad rap for the cicadas because it's things like, well, you know, this guy was driving a milk truck down the road and he had the windows open and a cicada landed on his head and scared him and he crashed the truck. I mean, that could have been anything, right? That wasn't a cicada problem, but there's actually a scientific paper about cicada-related injuries. The most important thing, though, that I want to get across with this general overview of cicadas is they're not pests, they're not problems, they're not a pestilence, they're not really food anymore for us. They don't injure you, they don't harm you, they don't sting the trees. It's not a plague visited down from heaven, and it doesn't really mean that war is any more or less likely now than it ever was. They're just part of our forests. This is something that's here. They've been part of North America. These species are old. Our estimates are 2.5, 3 million years old on these species. They've been around a while. They've been interacting with these tree species for a while. They're part of the ecosystem. They're not a problem. They're a natural part. And they cycle nutrients. They do all kinds of things that are important. So what I hope to get across is there's something to be appreciated, not feared, and something to marvel at. This is a way of making a living on this planet. It's a mighty strange way. It's not something you might come up with if you were sitting down with a blank sheet of paper thinking about writing science fiction. But it's a viable way of making a living. And, you know, it's been going on for 3 or so million years, and we hope to see it go on for a long time more. So I want to have people go out there and appreciate how wonderful this is. And I'll talk about the specifics of these guys a little bit this afternoon. What I'll do right now, though, is open it up to questions.
When will they be hatching? What's the time frame of hatching?
Well, that's an interesting question that we face here. So we're in brood 4, right here. And this is the historically reported range of brood 4. And I'll talk a little bit about that this afternoon, the mapping and the historically reported ranges. There are a lot of problems with that. You know, nowadays, when we go out and look for something, we have tools that you didn't have 100, 200 years ago. Entomology has come a long way in 100 or 200 years as well. If you ever worked in a museum and museum collections, you'll know that standards for identifying things and labeling them were probably a little bit different back in the day from how they are now. And we're getting better at disseminating knowledge. And so when you have a situation where you have old records, and they say there were periodical cicadas here, you can't take that at face value. Now we know there are periodical cicadas in this area, and we know there's some on the property right here. But we don't have good records through time telling us about the densities or how widespread they are. And one of the things, and I'll talk about this in some detail this afternoon, is you're at the northern limit of periodical cicadas. There is no denying that. This is as far north as they go. Funny things happen at species range limits. They become very patchy. And so you are not going to have, and I'll put my money on this one, you're not going to have the kind of widespread, just blanketing sci-fi horror nightmare emergence that you're going to get further south in brood 4 or in brood 23. You want to see periodical cicadas, go to southern Illinois. It'll make your head hurt. You're not going to get that. What you're going to get is patchiness around here. It's going to be restricted to patches. And they had better get moving on getting out if they're coming out at all, because the season's moving along. So everybody's talking about the weather. We've had some pretty strange weather around the country this spring. But if they're not starting to show significant signs by about this week, they're not coming. So that's something we need to keep in mind. They will be somewhere. We need to find out where those somewheres are.
This morning, and Neil Woods, all over the place.
Yeah, nymphs, or mergers, or callers.
Well, shells all over the place, the adults flying all over the place, and the woods throbbing with noise.
Yep. So it's very, very patchy.
And Neil Woods is our north location.
Yep.
So
I'll be paying that a visit.
Yeah.
It's not far
Yeah.
down to you at the hotel.
But that's what we expect here, is patchiness.
How deep down do they burrow into the ground?
That's an excellent question. So who here has ever built anything? What's legal frost line around here? 2 or 4 feet, something like that. You want to build a house or something, you have to dig a foundation. Building inspector is going to have to come out and inspect the foundation. The footings are going to have to be below frost line. And there's a legal frost line, and you look it up in the building codes. Probably about here, it's on the order. I know back in Connecticut, it's 42 inches. If you want to build anything, you have to dig 42 inches through horrifying New England soil. And that's not like digging 42 inches out here. It's like 42 inches of rock.
Yeah.
So it's probably about on the order of 3 feet or something like that. One of the ways that we study periodical cicadas is to dig up the nymphs. And actually I was doing that 3 weeks ago with a project that we have. Every time I've dug, you get them within 10 inches. I've never had to go down 42 inches to get a periodical cicada nymph. And I've dug in November and never had to go down more than a couple of inches. What's that all about? Now, the first couple of inches freeze in the soil. They should, or they used to. I know that we've had issues in Connecticut with the soil not freezing, just due to the way our winters have been the past couple of years. But it ought to freeze. These animals have some way of not being destroyed by that. And that's a curiosity. I'd love to know how they do that. Do they have antifreeze in them?
Would it be similar to amphibians?
Yeah, might be. I don't think they're all of a sudden going to get turbocharged and dig down another 40 inches in November. I mean, they're slow-moving animals. It takes them a long time to dig.
I'm kind of wondering, I was at Neil Woods the other day. They're all over, especially in the prairie too. And I didn't, yeah, in the prairie. So I know if the eggs are laid on the branches, and then the eggs hatch and the larvae they drop and they burrow into the ground. How are they emerging so much out in the prairie?
One of the things that I've forgotten about, but going back to Kansas, going back home, the red shoes, all that kind of stuff, that was for you, Greg, the Kansas joke.
Thank you very much.
I was subjected to that my entire youth. It blows out there. There is wind. Yeah, and it pretty much never stops in some of those places. And so the cicadas lay their eggs in the tree branches. And 6 to 8 weeks, whatever, after all the adults are dead and gone, the eggs hatch and the babies just launch themselves into space and they land somewhere. That process of launching into space and then hitting the ground, I mean, they can get moved around quite a bit. I think once they get into the ground, they probably don't move around that much. Again, they're kind of small, they dig, but how fast can you dig, even if you have 17 years to do it? So they go down there and they feed on roots. And all the old literature says they feed on tree roots. But you know what? You've all dug holes, right? You dig it up and there's roots. There's definitely roots. You dig it up, the world is full of roots. Do you have any idea when you get a root what that's attached to? The only time you find out is if it's poison ivy, and then you find out. They like poison ivy, by the way. They love poison ivy. But for the most part, you don't have any clue what this thing goes to. And the kind of study that would be required to figure it out, injecting radioactive stuff, whatever, you can't get permission to do those kinds of studies very easily. So all we really know is they're down there feeding on roots. And maybe the grass and prairie stuff, that's just adequate. Who knows? You don't know. So they could pop up there, then they're up, oh, got to find a tree. They'll go fly to things that stick up. So I had a question there, and then I'll get you.
So can we go back to the female song? So will she sing, or will a male sing without a male, or a female sing without a male? And does a male sing no matter what, or does it require?
Yeah, so this gets into the whole mating system. To make a long story short, and I'll talk more about this afternoon. Insects. You get into a lot of interesting mate theory. And my PhD thesis was on mating systems. That's what I was interested in. I actually started working on syrphid flies in high alpine tundra meadows in Colorado. And when you go into the theory of mating systems, it turns out, to wonder exactly how far to go with this here, males and females have different objectives in this game. And that is by virtue of their biology. These are animals that reproduce sexually, so they're eggs and sperm. The two are not equivalent in terms of investment by the individual making them. And what you tend to find in mating system theory is that the females tend to make the more individually valuable gametes. An egg takes a lot of investment. Sperm, no. And so you find this is fairly common. It's not ubiquitous. There are cases where it's swapped. But for the most part, the investment in individual offspring, the maximum investment is by females, not by males. And so when you think about the two sexes as strategies for reproducing, the female strategy is to maximize the success of her individual offspring. She's going to be choosy about who she mates with. The male strategy is to try to get as many matings as he can, which may actually just be 0, because not all males get to mate. And so there are two different strategies at play, and that actually shapes the entire mating system. Different agendas. So the females are choosy. Males are not. I'll give you examples of that this afternoon. They don't care, the males don't. So they're out there all the time trying to find a mate. They are ruthless. They are relentless. They will go dawn till dusk. And the way they find a mate is by singing their songs and by flying around. The females, different agenda. They don't have to find a mate. The mate's going to find them. All they have to do is choose. And I got into this business because I was interested in what that choice looks like. You talk about mate choice, are they trying to get the good male or just any male? It's a legitimate question. It turns out it's a lot simpler than I thought. There doesn't seem to be a lot of difference among these males. They're all just kind of the same. There's not, surprisingly, a lot of genetic variation within these populations. So there aren't different genes or alleles that females really can be choosing. The only thing that really seems to matter to the females is, A, don't waste my time. The irony of periodical cicadas is their enemy is time. So she's got to get a mating, the right kind of mating, quick, and pull this off quick and get done with it. Not going to waste a lot of time. Why? Because if you waste time, somebody else is going to find a place to put the eggs, and you won't. So she's got to maximize her time, and she has to get a mate of the right species. Turns out that's a big mistake, mating with the wrong species. And one of the odd things about periodical cicadas is most of the choruses are mixed species. So everything she's doing seems to be aimed at making sure the male actually is a member of her species. And that's it. The male, he didn't care. He mate with an acorn if he could. But the female, she's choosing someone of the right species. And that's what makes this whole crazy thing go. So he's calling dawn till dusk, but she just has to wait for the right time, the right place. She signals, she's going to get found and mated. right like that. It may be, and this is why that female signal was so elusive and never seen. She might only have to do it once in her entire life. Then she's made it, she's done. She mates once.
So in those chorus congregations, there's multiple different
There can
species
be.
of male
And female.
and female, and they're all singing.
They're all mashed together. Now again, at the northern limit, things get funny, but you've got Cassini on the property, and we know there is septendecim around here, so you got at least 2. And it's a big mistake if you're a Cassini female to get a decim male, because then your kids are dead. So we had a question over here.
I was just curious, have there been studies of the different trees that they may prefer, the type of branch or bark they are best able to?
Yes, there was a great study back in the 60s and 70s. Lloyd and Dybus looked at the oviposition preferences. They really like certain trees, and the different species like certain trees more than others. So for whatever reason, the Decula species, which we have not found out whether it's here in Nebraska yet, but they just love things like walnuts with these complex pinnate compound leaves. And Cassini kind of like those too, hickories, things like that. The decims just love oaks. They like oaks. They all hate maples. They're full of toxins. And the thing they really hate, and I don't even know if you get a lot of it out here, is liriodendron or tulip tree. And that is because the twigs are pithy. And so you stick your eggs down in there and they just die and rot. They hate pine trees because they're, you damage a pine tree and it makes resin and that suffocates that. And the killer is cherries. They like to feed on cherries, but if they go and lay their eggs in cherries, cherries have a wounding response. You mess up the bark of a cherry tree, and this gummy, horrible nightmare comes out and just seals it over and suffocates those eggs. So they will lay in cherry, and it ends badly. So,
What's the ratio of male and female in these ones? 50-50, or is it more
well,
males? Or?
if only that could be measured. One of the things that you find when you're dealing with an insect that comes in the millions is that it's very hard to quantify things like that. And so we assume that it's 50-50 because most insects work like that, but we have no actual way of measuring that we've ever convinced ourselves of. But that's not necessarily the question to ask. The question to ask is, what's the operational sex ratio? So sex ratio is one thing, but operational sex ratio is very different. So operational sex ratio refers to males and females that are ready to mate. And whereas the sex ratio in a chorus may be 50-50, if you think about the chorus as slices through time, at any one moment the operational sex ratio is 10 gajillion males to maybe 1 female. And it's the needle in a haystack. There might be, at any given moment, just 1 female there who's ready and willing to mate. And that's what makes this whole crazy thing go.
How do you tell the difference between a male and a female?
They tell them to be male and female. The female has an ovipositor, and we have a specimen. So you can do it on the nymphs, and I will show you. This is a male septendecim, and he's dead, so he doesn't make noise. When they're alive, it's easy because the males make noise. You can see his tymbals, and you can see that he's got, well, male genitalia. You can also see that on the nymphal skins. They're not fully formed, but you can see those parts on the nymphal skins. And I'll show you after we're done up close. You can see how that works.
Joni had a question. Joni.
Yeah, well, when you were talking about the female choosing the right species, is that maybe why there's kind of the 3 levels of courtship?
Mm-hmm.
That would help her?
Definitely think so. And I'll narrate this afternoon how we think that courtship works. These are, again, the kinds of things that are very difficult to demonstrate conclusively, at least to the level that peer-reviewed people in journals like. But I think it's how it works.
Take 2 more questions. Keith.
When there are 2 broods that come out at the same time,
Yes.
how does the mating kind of work? I know
So, that's only a problem when you're crossing life cycles. Because the 17-year broods, they're always, brood 3 is always brood 3, and brood 4 is always brood 4, and never the twain shall meet, except along the edges there's a little bit of fudging of those cicadas that make mistakes. But when you talk about the boundary between 13 and 17-year broods, it's a line that goes all the way from Maryland, dips way down into Georgia, and then back up into Illinois, and then down through Texas and all that. And along that line, at any given one spot, once every 221 years, the cicadas of different life cycles co-emerge. And exactly what happens, we don't know. But the last time brood 4 was out, in 1998, it was a co-emergence year with brood 19, the 13-year cicada. So down in Arkansas and Missouri, it was impossible to know who belonged to what brood. We think that there is the possibility for gene flow and intermating, but at least some of that doesn't work. That's another kind of hybridization that leads to no offspring. So there's one more question.
I have a question about annual cicadas. Do they eat the way the periodical cicadas do? Do they stay in the ground more than a year, or do they stay in the ground a year?
All excellent questions. So the annual cicadas, and the most common ones you're familiar with around here are bison, the big green cicadas. We know very little about their biology because it's not obvious. We don't know how long they live. We don't even know if they have set life cycles. So one of the funny things about periodical cicadas is they have set life cycles. You're going to live 13 or 17 years, and that's it. Maybe these guys are more facultative. They'll come out when they get big enough to come out. We don't know these things. As their basic biology is similar. They feed on xylem, actually. So it's not the phloem, those of you who are into plants. Think about this. They have a feeding mouth part. They're feeding on xylem. They have to drill through the phloem to get there. The phloem is where, this time of year, all the good stuff is. The xylem is watery. This is like having a steak on a paper plate and drilling a hole through the steak to eat the paper plate. That's what this is like. But they're feeding on this watery stuff. It may be as much for water balance as anything else because they get very hot when they're up there calling and they have to cool, evaporate. The bisons lay their eggs in bark or dead twigs, so they don't cause the flagging or the damage.
So is that true of, well, so is it true of all the annual cicadas that they eat xylem in the ground? They're all ground dwellers, they live in the ground?
Yeah, they're all, root xylem's a little bit different from shoot xylem as well, and xylem differs at the time of the year. Those of you who know about maple syrup, well, that's xylem, but it's very special xylem at the time of the year when the plant is moving materials, sugars back up into the shoot to make leaves. And that's not when the cicadas are feeding on this stuff. They're not eating maple syrup, they're eating maple water. But they're feeding on xylem below ground and above ground. Think of them as giant aphids, but louder.
Okay, I think we're going to stop here. We're going to do a hike.